let's start. So for today, there will be a little bit of lecture, meaning I will talk a little bit more about learning a new language and specifically about Ruby, and hopefully you can get you guys started. Then for the second part, we'll have the practice session where I will let you guys try to write some code for yourself. So that means for the first part, I will still stream using YouTube, but for the second part, we will switch to Google Meet, so that in case any of you run into any questions, you can skip it, and with Google Meet, you can speak up and ask me those things, as well as share your screen and show your code, something like that. All right. Now let's get into the content. So, first thing I want to talk about is install Ruby. So, if you're using Linux or Mac, it shouldn't be too difficult to install Ruby. Just Google install Ruby. Let me actually do that. You should be able to find plenty of documents about how to install Ruby. And then if you're using Windows, there's also a way to install Ruby on Windows. Like this search result from Google you can find. Although I personally would recommend still using Linux or Mac to run Ruby. Previously I had experience running Ruby on Windows, and unfortunately I ran into all kinds of issues on Windows. Although these days it has changed quite a bit, so I don't actually know the current status in terms of running Ruby on Windows. It might be a better experience now, but as far as I know, it's still a bit of a pain to run it on Windows. So if you're using Windows, a few options. You could still try to install Ruby on Windows, but be prepared for running into problems like some sort of error that you won't expect. And option 2, install a virtual machine. There's a free one for virtual machine hypervisor, which is VirtualBox. You can download it for free, install it, and then follow its documentation to find images that you could install to run the virtual machines. So that's the second option. And then if you are running virtual machine, I would recommend use Ubuntu for your first Linux distribution if you have no experience at all. You could just Google Ubuntu, and then you can find more information, and then if you search Ubuntu VirtualBox, you should be able to find the images you can download. Alright, that being said, feel free to use any other distribution if you feel like. And the third option would be to dual boot your computer, meaning so I would guess if you're using Windows, you probably will still be comfortable using Windows for a while, at least a while. But you could actually install 2 operating systems on one computer. If you don't know how to do it, just Google it, dual boot, and you should be able to find more information about that. And actually the first result here from Google is how to dual boot Linux and Windows. and you should be able to find enough information about that as well. So here are the three options, right? You could install Ruby on Windows, you could run a Linux virtual machine, you could do a boot to your computer. And I would recommend the third option if you're running Windows, because there are other disadvantages if you go with the first or second approach. All right. So with that, you should be able to Google your way and figure out how to install Ruby and run it. Okay. And then I already have my computer installed with Ruby, so you should be able to see my terminal or command line. And I have Ruby. It's out here. Oh. Okay. Oh, and then one more thing. I forgot to mention the other recommended stuff is RVM. Again, you could Google it. RVM. The first rollout would be their website. So RVM stands for Ruby Version Manager. It's in general a good practice to install some sort of version manager if you're a developer. Because imagine, today I started a project, and then I write it, let's say in Ruby, and let's say the latest version of Ruby is like, let me see, it's 2.7, right? And then most likely the project will stick to 2.7 at least for a while. You don't want to change the versions too often, because then you may run into compatibility issues and then fix unnecessary bugs, right? And then down the line, let's say 2 years later, I start another project, and by that time Ruby 2.7 may not be the latest version anymore. Let's say it's 2.9. Then most likely you want to install 2.9 to start that project, and then let's say in the middle of the second project you somehow need to go back to the first project to work on some feature enhancement, bug fixes. Then you would end up wanting to run two different versions of Ruby on a system in order to develop and write code and test it out for both projects. Of course, you can do all that in like virtual machine or something like a Docker container, where in that case all these two projects will have its own separate virtual environment where it won't influence each other, and then you can safely install two different versions. But there is something not that convenient, because if you go with virtual machine, every time you want to develop that project, boot up the local development environment, you will end up waiting like a few minutes. Of course, these days computer gets faster. You can have SSD. It can boot up like in 30 seconds or a minute, but it's still some time that you need to wait if you use virtual machine, and it's annoying, honestly. Same for Docker. Also, Docker is much faster, but there are other disadvantages in terms of Docker. You need to figure out how to do the container, and then if you connect to a database or something like that, then that's an additional configuration you need to do. Okay, that being said, if you don't want, you can skip this step, but again, personally I would recommend use a version manager, and in this case Ruby version manager or RVM, there's documentation about how to install it, and then it actually comes with option to install it as well as Ruby, to install Ruby, to install RVM, Ruby, and Rails altogether within one command. Okay. So I already have that installed on my computer. And let's actually get to some of the practices. So this is the first option. Actually, this should be the second option, as it's less convenient to set it up. But anyways, I will take this one as an example. So this is also going to be one of your homework options for this week. You can find it, I have the link here. It's under the SAS book GitHub repo, and the repo is homework Ruby intro. Okay. And then if you want to do this exercise, you could just follow what I do here. So first, clone the repo somewhere into your computer. And if you are not familiar with git command, I guess you will need to put that extra legwork to learn some basics of git. Or you could just simply type the same command that I'm doing here. So I've cloned the repo. Actually, I shouldn't clone that. Okay, let me reverse it. The first thing you actually want to do is fork it, because if you want to do this homework, you will need to submit your Git repo for your solution. So what you want to do is fork it. I've already forked it. So, and this is my fork. So instead of cloning the original repo, I should have cloned my own fork, and I cloned my fork. Okay, so now I have the code copy here. And I'm using Sublime editor for my IDE. Feel free to use anything you feel like. Let me add that window here. One moment. Okay, so hopefully you can see my text editor. So I have the code copy here. You can see all the files. There's README. You can read through the README for more information. Basically, for this practice, you are looking for passing all the tests that's already here. But first thing first, you cd into the directory, run bundle install. I've already run that, so it's returned immediately. If it's your first time running bundle install, it will take a while for it to install all the dependencies. Right? And oh, and actually it has the documentation here. And what you want to do is to run this one, rspec quiet rspec and the spec file. So there are 3 spec files. This homework's broken down into 3 separate sections, so you could do it one by one. Otherwise, you will see too many failure messages from the test. So, so here I run this command to run the first set of tests, and you could see most of those failed, which is as expected, because later we will talk about TDD. We have the test first, and the test kind of serves as a specification of what are the programs supposed to be functioning, right? If you look at this one, so it's further broken down into more sections. Hopefully you are familiar with indentation, so each indentation is kind of a block. So the first part, it tests this function or this method, which is called sum. And by the name of it, we can kind of guess. Sum is basically passing whatever number into it, an array of number or a set of number into it. It should sum all these number up and then return the sum, which should be pretty straightforward. But here, by looking at the tests, you can see more specifications, and it offers the test cases and their corresponding results. So then your goal is to write this, program the solution, and then have it pass all the tests. And then here is where you can find the skeleton of the code you are going to write. And for part 1, the first method is sum, and then you basically put out your own code here. Okay. So that's a quick get started tutorial about how to do the first option, or actually this should be the second option for your code practice. You could also do that as your homework. And then you have the link here. You should be able to see it. Should have the link here. Okay, and then because the book call all the hands-on practices or homeworks as chips, so we will follow the same naming convention. We call this the chip practice. So you can find this option here. Follow the link, and then you can follow the commands I just run a moment ago to set it up. And before getting to the second option, I want to talk a little bit more about linter. Last week I've mentioned that, and then I promised to show you some examples. And since we're going to have code practice, it would be a good idea to just do the example here, right? So now let's say I'm going to do to implement the first method. And for now I just write something, okay? Let's say I want to have a conditional clause. So if this one, if this argument exists, I want to return true, else return false. And okay, let's say let's pretend it's another function I'm writing. Okay, and then I wrote some code to implement the actual business logic in it. And what linter does, here I actually need to install linter. Let me get the browser back up here. Robocop. So I've mentioned this gem. That's the most popular linter for Ruby. And it has the documentation about how to install it, because we already have the bundler. We just copy this line and put it into gem file. And let me go back. So you should be able to find the file here. At that line. Again, run bundle install to install these dependencies declared in this gem file. Okay, so now I have Robocop installed, which is the linter, and I will show you how it looks like. Robocop. Yep. So by running this command, I'm telling it to use Robocop to run a linter test against this file. If you don't specify the file, I think it will just test all the Ruby files under the current directory. But since everything else is kind of irrelevant because it's not I personally wrote, so I don't want to test those. So let's now take a look at the test results. It says missing frozen spring literal comment. So it's basically complaining if you're writing a comment, you should write it in a different style, which I don't care. Let's just look at what I wrote. So I just wrote 5 lines of code here. Let's just say if it has any complaint about that, or warning about that, or a style issue about that. So here is the first thing. It talks about use a guard clause, return true if, instead of wrapping the code inside. So it's basically saying don't wrap wrap the return in a conditional clause. Instead, use a guard clause. You can find more details, and like you can take this warning message and Google it and find more details and figure out what's the actual recommended way to code it. But later I will show you how to do it since I already know it. It complains about redundant return, and which is this line, line 7, and then line 9 it complains about the redundant return, and then it complains about something else. Okay, so then let's see. According to the recommended styling, basically the linter is recommending some styling issues, right, for me to fix. And the recommended way actually for Ruby is to not add the return because it's unnecessary. Let me Robocop again, and you could see the complaint about line 7 and line 9 has disappeared. And by doing that, you actually would start to think like, so then why do I delete the return, right? Because in most of the programming languages, in order for you to return a value from a function or a method, you need to use the return keyword. But this is a special feature in Ruby, where if it is the last variable or the last value that gets run in a function or method, it will return the last value. So in this case, if this one is true or truthy, it will return true, even though I don't write the return keyword, because this is the last line that this method would actually execute. So then here when I call the sum method, I should got true. And otherwise, false is the last row. Then the function will return false. So this is a interesting feature from Ruby. But if you don't use a linter, you may miss this feature. And then when you, let's say, read someone else's code, then you might get confused. So this function doesn't return anything, you would assume, if you're not familiar with this character of Ruby. And you will start to wonder then, so this function or this method returns null or undefined, or returns nothing. Then if you think that way, you will have some misunderstanding of the function, or of how this function is supposed to work. And then if it's in a real project, most likely you're resulting in a bug. So what I want to say, something like this one here, you could actually learn if you use a linter. And it's the same thing applies for other programming languages. So I personally would recommend use a linter at the beginning, especially at the beginning when you first started with a programming language, because it really helps you to learn some of the hidden features, as well as it helps you to develop, to understand the recommended style to write code in certain language. So let's quickly take another look at the stuff it's complaining about. It says to use the guard clause. It actually, it's not here. Anyway, so the other warning is shows like this one. So instead of use if and else, I could actually do this. So this is another recommended style according to Robocop, the coding standard, or the recommended styling according to Robocop. Instead of writing, let me actually copy and paste here. Instead of writing something like this, if else and, we could do this one. Return true if it's true, otherwise false. You may not right away understand what's the point, because roughly the same amount of code, although here we did it in 5 lines, but here we could just do it in 2 lines. But it's actually what in last week's lecture the professor talked about, to write beautiful code so that it can be more readable later for someone else, or even for yourself, somewhere down the line. So if we take this one further, still the if condition situation, what we often find in code is the conditional clause get nested, right? So let's forget about that. True. And then sometimes we nest it further, force, right? This is a very typical thing you would see happening in some code. Of course, these things sometimes get more complicated, right? More stuff going on in certain condition, and something else going on for the other condition. Let me just dot it. And then when you get to this point, it will become difficult to figure out the indent, right? You would wonder, so is this line of code running under this condition or this condition, right? Once you nest stuff, it's more cognition load when you try to read the code. Whereas if I have the guard clause here, it actually becomes easier to understand. Return force, let's say, and then if something else, return true. And of course, in this case, we will remove the last return because we don't need to, but I'll just leave it here. So if we read this piece of code, it's much cleaner because we already know that in this condition it will do something and then return, and in this condition it does something and returns, and then otherwise it runs that and return true. Hopefully I've made the point. But the idea is, I would recommend all of you to give linter a shot, and especially for someone learning a new language, it's really helpful to for a beginner to pick up the code tastes. Where the other lecture, the professor talked about code smell. If a code smells bad, it means some code is not that beautiful or basically not really easy to understand. But without enough training, it's actually very easy for beginner to get into bad habit or bad coding habit, which will result into smelly code. So for you to develop a good code taste, or basically good coding habit, linter is something that's really helpful. It's almost like a personal tutor that always reviews your code and then give you recommendations on things that can be improved. Alright, so hopefully I've made my point here about linter. And next we will get into the other option for your coding practice, which will be the code walls. I've already mentioned it. Let me hide the overlay. So I've already mentioned it in last lecture, I believe. So just go to codewalls.com, register, create an account, and I've got a list of practices that I handpicked, from the fundamental things to basic language features to some more advanced stuff. But for the time being, just for demonstration purposes, I will just pick one, even on odd. So I just picked the first one. Oh, did I already do it? No. Okay, so if you click one of the link here, and if you already have an account, you will get to a page like this. So I think because my default is different, otherwise for you guys it's probably default to Ruby if you create an account with Ruby. You have a title of the practice. You have, or in this website it's called kata. Okay. This is difficulty. 8 is the easiest one, and then 1 is the most difficult. You can see some reviews and other stats about this kata, and you have a description. Because this one is simple, so the description is pretty short. Okay, just read it, understand what this one is trying to ask you to do. then click train. Then you will have this web-based code editor. All right. So I will just do this one. So let's say I will do it the wrong way first. Let's say I just always return even, and you can actually see the sample tests here. Okay. So you can run tests. So here down here. Oh no, you cannot see it. Let me grab myself. Okay, no, this one. Grab myself. Yes. Okay. So you can see two buttons here. Run tests. It will basically test your code against the sample tests here, which of course fails because it's expecting even, odd, but I'm always returning even. So it got it wrong. That's why the test will fail. Okay, so now I will try to do it the right way. We'll use the guard class here. So if it's the remaining is 1, return odd, otherwise return even. Hopefully I got it correct. Test it. I passed all the tests here. And there are actually additional tests. Oops. There are actually additional hidden tests that you cannot see from here. These tests are just as it is said here, it's sample tests. So to really pass the practice, there are usually more hidden tests. So once you think your code is good, you can attempt. It will run some additional tests, and you'll see that you pass all tests, and then you can submit your solution. Okay, and then after you submit a solution, basically the practice is done for you, and then you would see other solutions available that was submitted by others, and if you think one of the solutions is really great, you could upvote it. So that's how you could actually learn more from just solving the problem. Of course, the most important thing is to get the correct solution. But on top of that, the other thing we've always been saying, write beautiful code, right? By learning from others, you actually could learn, and then you could actually see different ways that others write the same code in a different way, and you could have your own decision. Is that nicer? Is it easier to read? And in this case, I will say yes, this is much more cleaner. So basically it's saying, is this number even? If yes, return even, otherwise return odd. So that's super clean, right? Okay, so that's the whole process for code walls. And then going back to the lesson content, you can find a set of code walls kata here for you to practice. And once you solve it, you can actually see the solution. By looking at the solutions, you could learn more from others. And the other situation, let's say this task, and somehow you just cannot figure out how to do it, right? you could actually go with this option if you click solutions. And initially the solutions are locked, but what you can do is just force it to unlock it. And then you can directly see the solutions submitted by others. Try to avoid using that if possible, but if you are stuck for like 15-30 minutes and looking at yourself feeling like you're getting nowhere, in that case, you could just unlock the solutions and learn from others. That's not necessarily bad, but don't always do that. Like, don't just, oh, I don't know, and then give up and then look at the solution. Try not to do that, but if you really feel stuck, feel free to do so. Okay, so that's all for the lecture and some examples about linter, and get you guys started with actually coding in Ruby. Oh, and then the good thing about code walls, if you don't want to install Ruby and go through all that trouble, for example, if you just aim for the grade B for this course and you don't feel confident doing all the coding thing and all the bonus homeworks, but if you still feel like trying it out, Code Walls is a good way to try it because you don't need to install anything, right? All that you need is a browser, and then you can write Ruby in the web-based editor, and then even run tests. So that's also a great option for you to try out certain programming languages if you don't feel like installing the runtime in your computer. Okay, so before we get to the actual practice session, I will talk about the homework. So for week 2, the homework is the basic option, or for grade B, what you can choose is write a summary about the second chapter from the textbook. Okay, just same as the first week homework. First week was to write a summary about chapter 1, and this week is chapter 2. So that's the basic option. And the bonus option, which is the coding option, is to choose one of these. If you still remember, we've talked about this Git repo, right? Fork it and clone it into your computer, and then run the tests. It will fail, and then implement the methods until it passes all the tests, and commit it, push it back to GitHub. And then submit the GitHub link to the classroom. That's the first option for the bonus homework option. And the second option, which is the code walls, you will get all the stuff here. Yeah, all the kata here. You basically go to these kata one by one, click the train button, solve it, submit a solution. And once you've done all that in your profile, so when you hover over your avatar, you would see a menu, click view profile, you will get to your profile page, go to solutions tab, and then you will see all the solutions you've solved or you've completed. And then once you've done all that, all your solutions should be here. Take a screenshot of this page, where I can see all the solutions of yours. You may want to scroll it a bit further so it can load additional stuff. Okay. And then submit the screenshot into the classroom. So hopefully I've made myself clear. So first, for the basic option, the basic homework option, write a summary about chapter 2. For the bonus homework option, you could go with the chip Ruby intro GitHub repo and solve that, or go with the code was kata and solve all these katas. Uh, so these are the 3 options for week 2 homework, and this is also going to be the content for our practice session. So you could choose to do the Ruby intro. You could also choose to do the code was katas. Okay. Any questions so far? Alright, so then we will end the live stream, and I will start a Google Meet and send it into the chat room. If it's on-site, if this is a on-site class, I would actually have everybody sitting on the desk, doing your practice on your own computer, and I will be sitting in the room waiting for your questions. But since we're doing it online, I would just be waiting in the Google Meet, and whenever you get a question, join the Google Meet, ask me the question. If you need to show your code, feel free to screen share and share the code there. But otherwise, we'll call it for today's lecture. Right, so let's end the live stream, and then let's move to the Google Meet.